What if every prayer you've ever spoken has been keeping you further from God rather than bringing you closer? I know that sounds almost blasphemous. After all, we've been taught since childhood that prayer is our lifeline to the divine, our way of reaching out to God when we need help. But stay with me until the end of this video, because what you're about to discover might completely transform not just how you pray, but your entire relationship with the divine itself. For most of your life, you've approached God like a cosmic vending machine. You insert your prayers, asking for healing, begging for financial breakthrough, pleading for relationship restoration. And you wait for the universe to dispense what you've requested. Sometimes it works, most times it doesn't. And when it doesn't, you pray harder, you pray longer, you add more intensity to your petitions, convinced that if you just ask with enough faith, with enough persistence, God will finally hear you and respond. But here's the uncomfortable truth nobody talks about in churches or spiritual gatherings. Every time you ask God for something, you're actually declaring to the universe that you don't already have it. When you beg for peace, you're energetically affirming, "I am anxious." When you pray desperately for abundance, you're unconsciously broadcasting, "I am in lack." It's a spiritual paradox that keeps millions trapped in an exhausting cycle of asking, waiting, and disappointment. Has this ever happened to you? You pray intensely for something you desperately need, pouring your heart out with tears and trembling hands, only to watch the situation deteriorate even further. You cry out to God for clarity about a major life decision, but instead of answers, you find yourself more confused than before. You beg the heavens for relief from anxiety, yet the tightness in your chest only grows stronger. The racing thoughts only accelerate. But before we begin diving deeper into this profound shift, please hit the like button and let me know where in the world you're watching from today. It's always fascinating seeing who's joining us from around the world. And if you haven't already, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any of our future videos. There's a reason your most fervent prayers sometimes produce the opposite of what you're seeking. It has nothing to do with God punishing you, testing your faith, or ignoring your cries. The truth is far more subtle and far more powerful than that. When you pray from a place of desperation, when your consciousness is consumed by what you lack, you're actually tuning yourself to a frequency that attracts more lack. Your energy, your vibration, your entire being is resonating with absence rather than presence, with emptiness rather than fullness. What truly changes when God becomes your only thought isn't about praying harder or asking better. It's about discovering something the mystics have known for centuries, but modern spirituality has almost completely forgotten. Something that transforms you from a beggar at heaven's gate into a living channel of divine consciousness itself. And that transformation begins with understanding why your current approach to prayer might be the very thing standing between you and the miracles you seek. Think about how you've been relating to God all these years. You've treated the divine like a helpful friend, a cosmic advisor you call upon when things get difficult. You ask for guidance on your decisions. You request intervention in your circumstances. You petition for blessings on your endeavors. But what if this entire framework is built on a fundamental misunderstanding of what's actually available to you? The spiritual masters throughout history, the mystics, the enlightened ones who walked this earth with a radiance others couldn't explain, they discovered something that mainstream religion almost never teaches. They found that the most powerful spiritual state isn't asking God for anything at all. It's not about crafting better prayers or developing stronger faith in your petitions. The real transformation happens when you stop trying to get God to help you and instead allow God to literally become your mind. Not your helper, not your divine assistant waiting in the wings to respond to your requests, but your actual consciousness, your thinking, your awareness itself. This sounds radical because it challenges everything we've been conditioned to believe about the spiritual journey. We've been taught separation, that we are here and God is there, that we are human and God is divine, that there's an unbridgeable gap we can only cross through prayer and supplication. But the hidden truth the mystics discovered is that this separation is an illusion. The gap doesn't exist except in our own perception. Right now, in this very moment, divine abundance is flowing toward you like a river that has never stopped running. Guidance for every decision you face, healing for every wound you carry, love that transcends anything you've experienced. It's all moving in your direction, continuously, eternally, without pause. God isn't withholding a single thing from you. The universe isn't playing favorites, blessing some while ignoring others. The problem isn't on the supply side, it's on the receiving side. Your consciousness is tuned to the wrong frequency. Imagine a radio when it's set to 95.5 FM, but the broadcast you're seeking is on a 11.3. You won't hear the music no matter how loudly it's playing. The transmission is happening, perfect and clear, but you're simply not positioned to receive it. This is exactly what's happening in your spiritual life. Your mind is so consumed with anxious thoughts about what you don't have, so busy generating controlling strategies to make life work according to your plans, so filled with the desperate energy of asking and seeking that you can't perceive what's already being given. If this resonated with you, subscribe and join this community of seekers, exploring what it means to let God be your mind. Each video takes us deeper into living from divine consciousness. Behind the scenes of your conscious awareness, divine intelligence is orchestrating solutions, arranging circumstances, preparing breakthroughs. But when your inner radio is tuned to the frequency of fear and lack, you miss the revelations entirely. Now, I want to go even deeper into this topic, because understanding the mechanics of this shift, how to actually retune your consciousness and step into this flow, changes everything about your daily experience. Write, "I'm ready to receive," in the comments if this is starting to resonate with something you've always sensed but never quite understood. Let me give you a simple metaphor that makes this crystal clear. Imagine there's a radio station somewhere in the cosmos broadcasting the most exquisite music you've ever heard. This broadcast runs 24 hours a day, 7 days a week without interruption. It's been playing since before you were born and will continue long after you're gone. The music contains answers to questions you haven't even asked yet, solutions to problems you're currently facing, guidance for decisions that keep you awake at night. Now here's the critical question, and this is where most people miss the entire point. The question isn't whether this broadcast exists. It's not whether the station is powerful enough to reach you. The music is always there, always transmitting, always available. The only question that matters is this: are you tuned in to receive it? When your internal radio is set to the frequency of anxiety, when the dial is turned to the station of fear and doubt, when your consciousness is locked onto the channel of control and striving, you simply cannot hear the divine transmission. It's not that God has gone silent. It's not that the universe has stopped communicating with you. The broadcast continues perfectly, clearly, powerfully, but you're positioned on the wrong frequency, listening to nothing but static while blaming heaven for not speaking. This is the hidden truth about why your prayers seem unanswered. Divine intelligence is constantly transmitting breakthroughs directly to you, insights about your career, revelations about your relationships, clarity about your purpose, solutions to your financial struggles. The transmission never stops. But when your mind is cluttered with fear-based thinking, when you're operating from that desperate energy of asking and begging, you're essentially trying to receive a clear signal through massive interference. And here's where the real impact of this understanding begins to transform your entire experience. Every time you pray from a place of desperation, something happens at an energetic level that most people never recognize. Your entire being starts vibrating at the frequency of lack. It's subtle, barely noticeable on the surface, but it's there in every anxious petition, every worried plea, every frantic request. Underneath your words, beneath your intentions, there's this relentless energetic signal broadcasting out into the universe. I am incomplete, I am broken, I am separate from what I need. Think about how this plays out in everyday human interactions. When someone approaches you from a place of desperate neediness, what happens? You instinctively pull back. There's something in their energy that creates distance rather than connection. The same principle operates on a universal scale. When you relate to life from the vibration of scarcity, opportunities that might have opened for you remain closed. Doors that could have swung wide stay locked. Not because you're being punished, but because the universe is responding to your energetic signature, not your spoken words. You can say all the right affirmations, recite all the perfect prayers, but if your underlying vibration is screaming, "I don't have," life will mirror that back to you with more experiences of not having. This is the journey every spiritual seeker must understand. The transformation isn't in your words, but in your frequency. Now, I want to go even deeper into this topic because recognizing the problem is only the beginning. What happens when you actually shift this vibration? When you retune your consciousness to the frequency where God's thoughts become your thoughts, changes your reality in ways you cannot yet imagine. Type shifting frequency in the comments if you're beginning to see how this pattern has been operating in your own life. So what actually happens when you make this shift? When you stop broadcasting lack and start allowing God to think through you, the transformation that unfolds is nothing short of extraordinary, and it happens at levels most people never even consider. The moment you surrender your anxious thoughts and let divine consciousness become your mind, an entirely different energetic reality begins to emerge. Instead of vibrating at the frequency of "I don't have," you start resonating with fullness. Instead of operating from that exhausting sense of separation, you hear God there. You begin embodying union. There's a quiet confidence that settles into your being, and it doesn't come from ego or positive affirmations you're forcing yourself to believe. It comes from a deep, cellular recognition of something that's always been true. What God has, I have. What God is, I am. Now, I know how that sounds. It sounds arrogant, maybe even blasphemous, depending on your religious background. But this isn't arrogance at all. It's actually the most humble acknowledgement possible, because you're finally recognizing that your good doesn't come from your own clever thinking or relentless striving. It flows through you as divine expression, the same way a river flows through a channel it didn't create. And here's where this stops being abstract, spiritual philosophy, and starts showing up in your actual, tangible, everyday life. The impact of this mindset shift becomes measurable in ways you can observe and experience directly. Those decisions that have been paralyzing you with fear, the ones that keep you awake at 3 in the morning running endless scenarios in your mind, they suddenly become clear, not because you're trying harder to figure them out, not because you've done more research or consulted more people, but because divine wisdom flows through you naturally when your anxious thinking finally steps aside. It's like clouds parting to reveal the sun that was always there. You didn't create the sunlight, you simply stopped blocking it. Opportunities that were always present but completely invisible to your cluttered consciousness suddenly appear right in front of you. You wonder how you missed them before. The answer is simple. You were so busy generating your own solutions, so consumed with controlling outcomes, that you couldn't see what the universe was already arranging on your behalf. Behind the scenes, divine intelligence has been orchestrating circumstances, but you were too distracted by your own mental noise to notice. Even your relationships begin transforming in ways that seem almost miraculous. That tension with your spouse, your children, your colleagues, It starts dissolving without you forcing conversations or manipulating situations. The healing happens naturally because you're no longer relating to people from a place of need and desperation. You're not looking to them to complete you or fix your emptiness. You're engaging from wholeness, from peace, from the overflow of divine consciousness expressing through you. This is the hidden truth about spiritual transformation. It's not about acquiring something new. It's about removing the interference that's been blocking what was always flowing in your direction. Now, I want to go even deeper into this topic because understanding what happens is powerful, but learning how to actually practice this in the midst of your chaotic daily life, that's where the real revelations begin. Share divine consciousness in the comments if you're feeling this shift happening in your own awareness right now. The beautiful truth about this transformation is that it doesn't require elaborate rituals, years of training, or some mystical initiation. It begins with something so simple you might be tempted to dismiss it. Just 10 minutes of your day, that's all. But here's what makes these 10 minutes different from every other spiritual practice you've tried. You're not going to approach this like you're placing an order at a restaurant, rattling off your list of needs and demands to some cosmic server who may or may not bring what you requested. Instead, you sit quietly, maybe in the morning before the chaos begins, maybe at night after everyone's asleep, and you say one simple thing within yourself. I'm now open to receive all that God is giving me. Notice the shift happening in that single sentence. There's no begging, no bargaining, no desperate pleading for specific outcomes. You're not trying to convince the universe to finally pay attention to your needs. You're simply acknowledging a truth that's always been operating. Divine supply is already flowing, and you're opening yourself to receive it. This moves you from that exhausting energy of pushing and striving to the natural flow of receiving, the way the earth receives rain without effort or anxiety. Let me tell you about Maria, because her journey illustrates exactly what happens when you make this shift in real life, with real problems that probably mirror your own. For 3 years, Maria had been praying for financial breakthrough with an intensity that bordered on violence. She would literally shake her fists at heaven, demanding answers, begging God to fix her mounting debt and dwindling bank account. Every prayer was a negotiation, a plea, a desperate attempt to get the universe to finally hear her and respond. But here's the paradox she couldn't see. The more desperately she asked, the worse her situation became. It was like watching someone try to catch water with clenched fists. The tighter she gripped, the faster it slipped away. Her energy was pure lack, broadcasting "I don't have" so powerfully that opportunities seemed to avoid her entirely. When Maria discovered this teaching about receptivity, her first reaction was fear. If I stop asking, God will forget about me completely, she thought. But desperation had brought her to a place where she was willing to try something radically different. She committed to 30 days of this practice, 10 minutes each morning and evening, simply sitting in quiet receptivity, opening herself to divine supply without demanding how it should arrive or when. The first 2 weeks felt like torture. Nothing seemed to be happening externally, and internally she felt empty, almost frightened by the silence. But behind the scenes, beneath her conscious awareness, a profound transformation was taking place. That constant knot of anxiety that had lived in her chest for 3 years began loosening its grip. Then the shifts started appearing. An unexpected freelance opportunity came through an old contact she hadn't heard from in years. A debt she thought was permanent got mysteriously forgiven through a company restructuring. A refund check she'd completely forgotten about arrived in the mail. None of these things came from her striving or clever planning. They emerged naturally as she stopped blocking the flow with her desperate asking. Now, I want to go even deeper into this topic because Maria's story reveals something critical about how divine intelligence operates when we finally get out of our own way. Write "I'm opening" in the comments if you're ready to practice this receptivity in your own life. What makes this principle even more profound is how it applies to every area of human struggle, not just financial challenges. Take David's story, for instance. For 5 years, he battled a chronic illness that doctors couldn't fully explain or cure. His prayer life had become absolutely exhausting, an endless cycle of begging, pleading, bargaining with God. He would spend hours visualizing his healing, trying to manifest wellness through sheer force of will, analyzing every symptom with mounting anxiety. The turning point came when he encountered this same teaching about surrender. At first, he resisted it completely. How could he stop fighting his illness? Wouldn't that be giving up? But as his condition continued despite all his efforts, he realized his approach wasn't working. He decided to try something radically different. Instead of battling his symptoms with anxious mental strategies, instead of begging God to intervene and fix his broken body, David began sitting quietly each day with one simple intention: opening himself to receive the perfect health that existed as his divine inheritance. He stopped treating his condition and started treating his consciousness. He surrendered his thoughts about being sick and allowed God's thoughts about wholeness to become his reality. Within a year, something his doctors called spontaneous remission occurred. His medical tests showed significant improvement that had no logical explanation based on his treatment history. David had a different name for what happened. He called it learning to let God be his mind. But perhaps the most challenging territory for this practice is relationships, because that's where our need for control shows up most intensely. Jennifer's journey demonstrates this perfectly. For years, she had been on her knees every single night, praying the same desperate prayer. Please change my husband. Make him understand me. Fix our communication. Transform him into the partner I need. Every prayer was focused outward, asking God to manipulate someone else, to force external circumstances to align with what she thought would make her happy. She couldn't see that this entire approach was reinforcing the very separation she was trying to heal. Her asking was broadcasting, "I am incomplete. He is wrong. We are broken." When Jennifer encountered this teaching about receptive surrender, she resisted it with everything in her. If I stop asking God to fix my marriage, it will definitely fall apart, she thought. But her current strategy clearly wasn't working, so she decided to experiment with something completely different. Instead of trying to control her husband or manipulate outcomes through desperate petitions, she began practicing something revolutionary, receiving divine love into her own consciousness. Each morning, she would sit quietly, surrendering all her judgments about what he should be doing differently, opening herself simply to receive God's love without conditions or demands. The transformation started so subtly she almost missed it. She found herself responding to him differently, less reactive when he said things that used to trigger her, more peaceful in situations that previously sparked conflict. And as she let God be her mind instead of operating from her own anxious thinking, the entire relationship dynamic began shifting naturally. Now, I want to go even deeper into this topic because what happened in Jennifer's marriage reveals something critical about how consciousness affects every relationship in your life. Put divine love in the comments if you're beginning to see how this could transform your own relationships. Here's what makes this practice truly revolutionary. You don't have to wait for those sacred 10 minutes of meditation to experience this shift in consciousness. In fact, some of the most profound transformations happen in the most mundane moments of your day. You're washing dishes, hands submerged in soapy water, mind wandering to tomorrow's meeting or yesterday's argument, pause. Right there. Acknowledge God is here. You're stuck in traffic, frustration rising as the cars ahead refuse to move. Pause. Recognize God is here. You're standing in line at the grocery store, mentally calculating your to-do list, already exhausted by what's ahead. Pause, notice, God is here. This isn't asking God to show up or begging for divine intervention to make the traffic disappear. It's recognizing what's already true in this exact moment. The divine presence isn't somewhere else waiting for you to summon it through elaborate prayer. It's right here, right now, in the ordinary spaces of your life. These micro moments become profound resets of your entire consciousness. Each time you pause to acknowledge the presence, you're training your awareness to surrender those controlling thoughts that usually dominate your mind and to remain in receptive mode instead. The impact accumulates over time. Where you once automatically responded to every challenge with anxiety and frantic mental calculations about how to fix things, you begin responding from a completely different place, allowing God to be your mind, trusting that divine intelligence is already working through situations in ways you can't yet see. And this brings us to perhaps the most important shift in understanding how to work with challenges when they arise. When you face difficulty, whether it's a health crisis, a financial emergency, or a relationship breakdown, the automatic human response is to identify the problem in great detail and then ask God to fix it. You focus intensely on the condition, analyzing every aspect of what's wrong, and then you petition heaven to come in and change it. This seems logical, even responsible. But there's a hidden flaw in this approach that keeps you trapped in the very condition you're trying to escape. By giving all your attention to the problem, by making it the center of your consciousness, you're actually energizing it, keeping it alive in your experience. The breakthrough comes when you realize something radical. You don't need to treat the condition at all. You treat your consciousness instead. When facing any challenge, instead of focusing on the problem and devising mental strategies to solve it, you practice something completely different. You say within yourself, I release this situation to divine intelligence. I open myself to receive God's perfect solution. I rest in the truth that infinite wisdom is already resolving this in ways I cannot see. Notice the fundamental shift happening here. You're not analyzing the problem. You're not asking for a specific outcome. You're surrendering your limited thinking about the situation entirely and allowing divine intelligence to work through it. This creates a gateway for solutions that your human mind, with all its limitations and fears, could never conceive. Now, I want to go even deeper into this topic because there's one obstacle that stops most people cold when they start practicing this way, and understanding how to navigate it changes everything. Write treating consciousness in the comments if this approach is making sense to you. The biggest obstacle that stops people when they begin practicing this way is a persistent, uncomfortable feeling that overwhelms almost everyone. The feeling that you're doing absolutely nothing. This discomfort can be so intense, so unsettling, that it drives people right back to their old patterns of asking, striving, and controlling. Because asking feels active, doesn't it? It feels powerful. It feels like you're taking charge, making things happen, being responsible for your life. Receiving, on the other hand, feels passive. It feels lazy. It feels almost irresponsible. Your ego starts screaming at you. You have to think. You have to figure this out. You can't just sit there and do nothing. You have to make something happen. The internal pressure to return to your old ways of operating becomes almost unbearable. But here's the revelation that changes everything. That uncomfortable feeling of doing nothing is actually a sign that you're making real progress. What you're experiencing is the dissolution of your habitual interference with divine flow. For your entire life, you've been operating under the assumption that you have to make everything happen through your own thinking and effort. Now you're learning to step aside, and it feels strange, almost frightening. The truth is, when you let God be your mind, you're not being passive at all. You're being receptive, which is profoundly active in the spiritual dimension. Think about how the earth receives rain. It doesn't strain or worry, yet something incredibly powerful is happening. Or consider how your lungs receive oxygen. There's no effort, no anxiety, yet your entire body depends on this receptive process. Receptivity is where the real power lives, and this brings us to the ultimate shift in understanding, the revelation, that transforms everything you've ever believed about yourself and your relationship with the divine. Your entire life has operated from one fundamental belief. You are a separate human being, disconnected from God, trying to get things from an external deity who may or may not respond to your requests. This belief has shaped everything. It's why you ask. It's why you beg. It's why you feel so desperate when prayers go unanswered. You're positioned as the spiritual beggar standing outside heaven's gates, hoping someone will throw you what you need. But here's the ultimate revelation, the hidden truth that the mystics discovered and that changes the entire game. You are not separate from God, trying to receive gifts from an external source. You are the very consciousness of God, receiving awareness of your own infinite nature. This isn't metaphor. This isn't poetic language designed to make you feel better. This is the actual truth about your identity. When you surrender every thought and let God be your mind, you're not getting something new that you didn't have before. You're removing the veil that has been blocking your recognition of what has always been yours. You're not becoming spiritual through effort and practice. You're recognizing the spirituality that has always been your essential nature, just covered over by layers of false identification. Now, I want to go even deeper into this topic, because understanding this intellectually is one thing, but experiencing what happens when you actually live from this awareness, that's where the real transformation occurs. Share "I am consciousness" in the comments if this truth is beginning to awaken something in you. If you've made it this far with me, I want you to know something. You're not here by accident. The fact that you've stayed through this entire exploration tells me you're genuinely ready for this shift in consciousness. You're not just casually browsing spiritual content, you're actively seeking the transformation that comes from letting God become your only thought. I create these videos because I truly believe these insights have the power to change lives, not through my words, but through the eternal truths they point toward. If this message resonated with something deep inside you, I'd love for you to join this community of seekers who are learning to move from separation consciousness to divine receptivity. Hit that subscribe button so you can continue this journey with us, because each video explores another dimension of what it means to live from divine intelligence rather than limited human thinking. And here's what would mean the world to me. Drop a comment below saying, "God is my mind," so I know you were here, that you received this message, that something shifted in you as we walked through this together. Your presence in this community matters more than you realize. If this video created a connection for you, a simple tap on the like button helps this teaching reach others who are searching for exactly what you just discovered. It's a small gesture that creates ripples far beyond what we can see. There's a video right here that goes even deeper into how divine consciousness operates when you completely release the illusion of control. Click on it and let's continue this conversation together. I'll meet you there.
My friends, let us come together for a moment in that inner quiet where truth is felt rather than reasoned. For in the silence of our being, we touch the essence of the message that has echoed across the centuries, a message spoken in 3 simple words upon the cross: "It is finished." And yet, though these words have been repeated by millions, their spiritual meaning remains largely veiled, hidden not by any design of God, but by our insistence on interpreting them through the limited lens of human thought. When Jesus uttered that statement, he was not declaring an end to life. He was revealing something far more profound, the eternal completeness of God's creation. He was announcing the end of the human belief that we stand apart from our source, the end of the sense of struggle, the end of the illusion that we must make ourselves worthy or whole. He was giving voice to the truth that spiritual fulfillment is not a distant attainment, not a reward for future effort, but a present reality awaiting our recognition. You see, the spiritual path is not the journey of becoming, but the gentle awakening to what already is. The work of God is finished. The harmony, the abundance, the wholeness, the peace, all of it stands completed in the infinite. Our task is not to add to creation, nor to improve it, nor to repair it, but to behold it. And so we begin not with striving, but with rest, not with petition, but with recognition, not with effort, but with awareness. Today, we will explore what truly occurs within us when we no longer attempt to make truth happen through human will and instead accept that truth already exists in spiritual reality. We will discover how consciousness shifts when it ceases to wrestle with appearances and learns to dwell in the presence behind them. And as this unfolds gently within you, you will begin to understand why Jesus could speak those words with such authority, because he was not speaking from the level of the world, but from the consciousness of the Christ, in which nothing is incomplete. Let us enter this study with a willingness to set aside all belief in personal achievement. Let us approach it not as seekers, but as those who are remembering. For the truth is not gained, it is recognized. And as we recognize even a measure of the finished nature of God's work, something within us begins to soften, to yield, to rest. It is this inner shift that opens the way for the fuller revelation to appear. This is where our journey begins. Now let us look a little more deeply into the spiritual meaning of this statement. It is finished. For unless we grasp the principle behind it, we cannot hope to live it. Nor can we understand the transformation it brings. In the human sense of life, everything appears to be in a state of becoming. We believe that health must be achieved, that supply must be earned, that harmony must be created. We believe that we are moving from imperfection toward perfection, from lack toward abundance, from fear toward peace. And so the world becomes a continual process of effort, of striving, of reaching for that which always seems just beyond our grasp. But in spiritual consciousness, nothing is becoming. Everything simply is, for God, being infinite, cannot evolve. God cannot grow. God cannot add to himself. And if God cannot evolve or grow, then his creation, being the expression of his own nature, also cannot evolve or grow. It stands complete, whole, finished, radiant in its perfection. This is the truth Jesus beheld when he declared, "It is finished." He was speaking from the standpoint of spiritual vision, the Christ mind, in which creation is seen not as a process, but as a fullness already accomplished. He was not referring to a moment in time. He was revealing an eternal state of being. You and I, viewing life through the lens of the human mind, see incompleteness everywhere. We see problems to solve, conditions to fix, deficits to overcome, but these are the shadows cast by our limited perception. They do not constitute spiritual reality. Spiritual reality remains untouched, unaltered, unblemished, because it is the activity of God, and the activity of God cannot be hindered, cannot be diminished, cannot be undone. When we begin to sense even faintly that the truth of our being exists already in its finished state, we start to loosen our grip on the belief that we must make life work. we begin to understand that our function is not to complete anything, but to witness what God has already completed. And in that witnessing, the nature of our experience begins to change. So long as we insist on living from the premise that something is missing, we remain bound to the realm of striving. But when we touch even for a moment the awareness that nothing is missing in God, and therefore nothing can be missing in the truth of our being, we shift from the human sense of life into spiritual consciousness. And it is this shift, gentle yet profound, that reveals what Jesus knew so completely, that the work of God is finished, perfect, eternal, and universal. Let us rest in that realization for a moment, not as doctrine, not as belief, but as truth. For the more deeply we comprehend this principle, the more naturally our inner life begins to align with a kingdom that is always present, always complete, always finished. Let us look now at one of the great obstacles on the spiritual path, an obstacle so subtle that even sincere students stumble over it repeatedly: the belief that through striving, through effort, through the exertion of the human mind, we can attain spiritual realization. This belief is the very heart of the illusion from which Jesus sought to free humanity. For what is striving but the conviction that something is lacking? And what is effort but the attempt of a personal sense of self to secure what it believes it does not yet possess? But you see, my friends, the moment we engage in striving, we are functioning from the standpoint of separation. We imagine ourselves cut off from the source of our being, left to our own devices to achieve peace, supply, healing, or harmony. And in that moment, we have stepped out of the awareness of God's completeness and into the dream of personal responsibility. We begin to live as if the weight of our entire existence rests upon our shoulders, and from that position, fear is inevitable. Most spiritual effort fails not because the student lacks discipline or sincerity, but because the effort itself arises from a false premise. If we believe that God's work is unfinished, then of course we will try to complete it. If we believe that God is withholding something, then naturally we will try to obtain it. And if we believe that God is far away, then we will strive endlessly to reach Him. But none of these beliefs are true, and therefore none of the actions that spring from them can bear the fruit of truth. In the infinite way, we do not seek to compel God to act, nor do we attempt to superimpose spiritual truth upon material conditions. Rather, we learn to relinquish the belief that conditions possess power at all. We learn to let go of the idea that our thoughts, our emotions, or our personal will can bring about spiritual demonstration. For spiritual realization does not come from human effort, it comes from the dawning of awareness. When we strive, we are attempting to lift ourselves by our own bootstraps, as though the personal self, the very thing that is unreal, could become the instrument of spiritual attainment. But the personal self cannot enter the kingdom of God, and no amount of effort will transform it into the Christ. Striving keeps us rooted in the belief that we are separate individuals, seeking something outside ourselves. Recognition reveals that we are expressions of the one divine self in whom all is already complete. It is a strange paradox. The harder one tries to achieve spiritual fulfillment, the more elusive it becomes. The moment we stop trying, the moment we release the belief that we must do something to attain God, the presence of God begins to reveal itself. Not because we have earned it, but because we have ceased resisting it. You do not enter the kingdom through striving. You enter by surrendering the belief that there is any distance to cross. You enter by yielding the personal sense of life and resting in the truth that spiritual reality is not created by your effort, it is recognized by your stillness. This is the shift from human striving to spiritual awareness, and it marks the beginning of true transformation. Let us now consider what takes place within us when we begin to respond to life, not from the human sense of mind, but from the quiet recognition of spiritual truth. For this is the turning point on the path, the moment when the center of our consciousness shifts, and we no longer live as though we are separate beings struggling to align ourselves with God, but as expressions of the one presence revealing itself. The first change is not dramatic. It is not a burst of light, nor an overwhelming experience. Rather, it is a softening and easing of the inattention we have carried for so long. The human mind, accustomed to constant vigilance, to controlling, to analyzing, to protecting itself, begins to relax. It no longer stands guard over every circumstance. It no longer assumes that it must interpret, judge, or manage each appearance that presents itself. A certain quiet confidence begins to dawn, not in our personal capacity, but in the completeness of God. This is the beginning of the Christ mind, the mind that does not react to appearances, but beholds the truth behind them. The Christ mind is not a superior intellect. It is the capacity to see with spiritual vision, to recognize that what the eyes and ears report is not the final word. It is the awareness that life, real life, is unfolding from within, and that nothing external has authority over the truth of our being. And as this recognition awakens within you, your perception changes. You may still see a discordant condition, but you no longer interpret it as a power. You no longer accept it as a reality. Instead, you stand inwardly still and listen for the assurance that spiritual reality is untouched. You begin to sense that behind every appearance, whether it be illness, lack, conflict, or fear, there exists a spiritual perfection already established, waiting only for your recognition. This does not mean you deny what the senses present. It means you cease granting them authority. You see the appearance, but you no longer fear it. You acknowledge the condition, but you are not governed by it. You become aware of something deeper, a presence that accompanies you, a peace that requires no outer circumstance to justify it, a stillness that is not affected by the movements of the world. The Christ mind reveals itself not through visions or sensations, but through the simple knowing that God is the only reality and that nothing exists outside of God. When this knowing begins to dawn, not as belief, not as theory, but as inner experience, the entire fabric of life subtly shifts. You find that you move more gently, speak more quietly, respond more patiently. You discover that you need not defend yourself, nor justify yourself, nor protect yourself, for your life is no longer resting in personal strength, but in the assurance of the infinite. This shift cannot be forced, nor can it be manufactured. It unfolds naturally as we cease striving and begin resting in the truth that the spiritual creation is finished. The human mind seeks solutions. The Christ mind beholds truth. The human mind reacts. The Christ mind rests. The human mind tries to make things happen. The Christ mind witnesses what already is. And so the transformation begins not with outward change, but with the quiet dawning of a new inward standpoint. The recognition that we are no longer living life through the limited lens of human perception, but through the consciousness that Jesus revealed, the consciousness in which lack dissolves, fear loses its foundation, and harmony flows effortlessly because it is already established in God. This is the shift from human mind to Christ mind. It is gentle, but it is the most profound change that can occur within an individual. As this inner shift begins to unfold, this movement from the human sense of mind to the Christ mind, you will notice something remarkable. Your relationship to the problems and circumstances of daily living starts to change. not because the external conditions have yet transformed, but because you have changed. Your consciousness has been touched by the awareness that spiritual reality is already complete, and from this standpoint, the entire meaning of a problem is altered. In the human sense of life, a problem is something we must confront, resist, solve, or overcome. We see it as an external force acting upon us, demanding response and often producing fear. But in spiritual consciousness, a problem is nothing more than an appearance without substance, without power, without spiritual law to sustain it. It is a shadow cast by the belief in separation, and when that belief begins to dissolve, the shadow loses its authority. This does not mean that difficulties will never arise in our experience. They may appear just as clouds may pass before the sun. But as the sun is unaffected by the clouds, so the spiritual reality of your being remains untouched by the passing conditions of the world. The difference is that now you no longer treat the cloud as a power. When a financial difficulty arises, you do not rush into panic or frantic effort. You do not plead with God, for you have learned that God does not withhold supply. Instead, you pause, you rest, you let the truth of God's infinite abundance fill your consciousness. You recognize that supply is not something to be attained, but something that already exists in the invisible, and that your recognition of it opens the way for its appearing in the visible. When a physical condition presents itself, you no longer fight it as though it had independent authority. You know it is an appearance based on the limited perception of the human mind. You acknowledge it, but you do not accept it as truth. You turn inward to the awareness of the one, life that cannot be sick, cannot be impaired, cannot be diminished, and in that inner knowing, the fear that once accompanied illness begins to dissolve. When there is discord in relationships, you no longer attempt to manipulate, correct, or control other individuals. You understand that the only relationship that truly exists is the relationship between God and His expression. Therefore, harmony is already established. Your task is simply to recognize that harmony, to rest in it, and to behold its unfoldment. You see, the outer actions may still take place. You may still make a phone call, see a physician, or have a conversation, but the spirit behind these actions has changed. They no longer arise from fear or urgency. They arise from peace, and actions taken from peace are guided, harmonious, and effective, because they are not born of the human will, but of the wisdom of the Christ within. This is the great secret. When the burden is lifted from your shoulders and placed where it belongs in the realization of God's completed work, you discover that the very conditions which once overwhelmed you now yield to the presence of truth, not by your effort, but by your non-resistance, not because you have controlled life, but because you have allowed life to be what it already is. And so your relationship to circumstances changes entirely. Problems no longer dominate you. They no longer define you. They no longer frighten you. They are seen for what they are, appearances that arise and dissolve within the field of consciousness, having no more reality than dreams upon waking. This is the freedom that begins to unfold when you live from the awareness that it is finished. Let us now explore how we may live this truth in practical terms, not as a theory, not as an inspiring concept, but as a daily, moment-by-moment way of being. For the kingdom of God is not attained through effort, nor entered through ritual. It is realized through recognition. And recognition, my friends, is a practice, not a technique or method, but a gentle returning of the mind to the awareness of what already is. When an appearance confronts you, an appearance of lack, an appearance of disease, an appearance of discord, the natural tendency of the human mind is to react. It rushes forward. It seeks solutions, makes plans, issues, judgments. But the first step in spiritual practice is to pause, to become still, to withhold reaction, not through force or discipline, but through the understanding that reaction itself is the acceptance of the appearance as power. In that pause, you turn inward, not to ask for God's help, not to plead for correction, but simply to acknowledge, in God's reality, this is already complete. In God's reality, nothing needs to be changed. In God's reality, the fullness of being is already established. This is not spoken as affirmation. It is recognized as truth. You are not trying to make it true. You are remembering that it already is true. And so you rest not in passivity, but in awareness. You rest in the assurance that the invisible spiritual kingdom is intact, unbroken, whole. You rest in the understanding that all that God is present here, where the appearance seems to be. You rest because the burden is not yours. You rest because the work is finished. Now, this practice may take only a moment, or it may take many moments. It may take silence. It may take returning again and again to the same simple recognition. And that is perfectly all right, for the purpose of the practice is not to change the condition, but to change your consciousness about the condition. As consciousness changes, the outer picture adjusts of its own accord. Some students say, "But I do not feel the truth when I acknowledge it." And I tell them, feeling is not required at the beginning. Recognition precedes feeling. First, the truth is acknowledged, then the consciousness shifts. Then the feeling follows. Just as the dawn precedes the sunrise, recognition precedes realization. This is why Goldsmith often spoke of keeping your mind stayed on God, not as a mental exercise, but as a continual resting in the awareness of the presence. It is the habit of turning within, again and again, until the within becomes more real to you than the without, until the truth becomes more compelling than the appearance, until the finished nature of God's work becomes the lens through which all of life is seen. In time, this practice becomes natural. You will no longer have to pause deliberately, for the pause will arise spontaneously. You will no longer have to remind yourself that God's work is finished, for that recognition will be the ground upon which your consciousness stands. And when this happens, you will discover that appearances lose their power to disturb you. They may come, and they may go, but you remain anchored in the awareness that behind every appearance is the eternal reality of God's completeness. Living from the finished kingdom is not a matter of effort. It is the gentle discipline of remembrance, the remembrance that nothing can be added to the perfection of God and nothing can be taken from it. The remembrance that all good is already established in the invisible. The remembrance that your life is the expression of God, and therefore the fullness of God must appear as your experience when you are still enough to behold it. This, then, is the practice of recognition. It is the foundation upon which the entire spiritual life rests. As you continue in this practice of recognition, this gentle turning toward the truth that God's work is already finished, you will begin to notice a transformation occurring within you. It is not sudden. It is not dramatic. It does not announce itself with fanfare. Rather, it unfolds quietly, like the way dawn breaks upon the earth, almost imperceptibly at first, until you realize the night is gone. The first of these transformations is the gradual dissolving of fear. Fear, you see, is always based on the belief that something real can be taken from you, or that something necessary can be withheld. But when your consciousness becomes rooted in the understanding that God's universe is complete, and that you live and move in that universe, the very foundation of fear begins to crumble, not because you have battled fear, not because you have argued with it, but because you have withdrawn your belief in the conditions that give fear its seeming power. You may notice that situations which once would have caused anxiety now elicit a calmer response. You may find that you are no longer anticipating disaster, no longer preparing for the worst, no longer carrying the inner tension that once accompanied uncertainty. Fear fades, not by conquest, but by recognition that God's completeness is the only reality. As fear dissolves, so too does the sense of lack. Lack exists only in the consciousness that believes itself separate from the infinite source of supply. But when you begin to live with the awareness that supply is not created by human effort but flows from the eternal nature of God, the idea of lack becomes foreign to you. You discover that your needs are met in ways you could not have planned or orchestrated. Not through striving, but through alignment. Not through demanding, but through resting in the truth that God's abundance is always present, always available, always flowing. This does not mean you will suddenly have everything the human mind desires. It means you will have what the divine plan for your life requires. You will find that what comes to you is appropriate, harmonious, and sufficient, because it comes not as a result of personal striving, but as the natural outflow of spiritual completeness. And as fear and lack lose their hold, something else begins to dissolve resistance. Resistance is the belief that life should be other than it is. It is the inner tension that arises when we oppose the appearance, when we fight against conditions, when we refuse to accept what is unfolding. But when you understand that every appearance is but a shadow of a deeper spiritual reality, you no longer resist. You allow everything to come and go without clinging, without fear, without judgment. This is not resignation. It is not passivity. It is trust, the trust that the intelligence of the Christ within you is guiding your life perfectly. It is the recognition that nothing real can oppose God, and therefore nothing unreal needs to be resisted. You begin to flow with life rather than against it, and in that flow there is great peace. This process, this dissolving of fear, lack, and resistance is not something you accomplish. It happens naturally as you rest more consistently in the truth that it is finished. The old patterns dissolve like mist before the sun, not because you have worked to eradicate them, but because your consciousness has shifted to a higher standpoint. And so, each day, without effort, you find that you are living with greater ease, greater trust, greater stillness. You are no longer buffeted by the storms of the world, for your anchor is not in the world, it is in the infinite completeness of God, already established, already present, already finished. This is the quiet miracle that begins to unfold when you live from the spiritual fact rather than the human appearance. Now we come to one of the most sacred unfoldments that occurs when one begins to live from the consciousness of the finished kingdom. As fear dissolves, as lack loses its hold, as resistance melts away, something far deeper begins to emerge, your true identity, the identity that has always been present but long obscured by the belief in separation. You see, the human sense of self is built upon the conviction that we are finite creatures, born into limitation, confined to personal strength, dependent upon external conditions. But this concept of self is nothing more than a mental image, a collection of memories, opinions, and beliefs that we have come to accept as me. It has no spiritual substance, no permanence, nor divine authority. As the light of recognition begins to dawn, this constructed self gradually loses its reality for you. You realize that you are not the mind that thinks, nor the emotions that fluctuate, nor the body that appears to age. You are not the personality with its preferences, its habits, its history. These belong to the realm of appearance, not to the truth of your being. What then are you. You are the spiritual expression of God. You are the visibility of the invisible. You are the place where the infinite individualizes itself, not as a separate being, but as an embodiment of the one life, the one love, the one intelligence. This is the meaning behind the words, I and the Father are one. Not two beings in harmony, not a human in communication with a distant deity, but one life expressed in infinite form. As this realization begins to unfold, you no longer see yourself as a seeker of truth. You recognize yourself as the expression of truth. You no longer try to attain God. You understand that God is the very essence of your being. You no longer attempt to bring God into your experience. You perceive that your experience is the unfolding of God. This shift in identity is not philosophical. It is not a matter of affirming I am divine. It is an inner awakening, a dawning awareness that your life is sourced in something greater than the personal sense of self. It is the realization that the qualities of God, love, peace, abundance, harmony, intelligence are not gifts bestowed upon you, but the very nature of your being. And as this realization becomes more established, your actions change, not because you are trying to be spiritual, but because your actions arise from a different center. You find that compassion flows more freely, not as a moral effort, but as a natural expression of the love that you are. You discover that wisdom guides your decisions, not as a product of careful thinking, but as a quiet inner knowing. You find yourself acting with greater ease, greater clarity, greater grace. You no longer ask, what should I do? But rather, what is the activity of God expressing through me in this moment? And you discover that the answer reveals itself without strain. This is the emergence of the real identity. It comes not with pride or superiority, for there is no personal achievement in it. It comes with humility, with gentleness, with awe. For to realize that I and the Father are one is to understand that you are nothing of yourself and yet everything in God. It is to recognize that the personal self has no power, no presence, no life of its own, and that all that you are is the manifestation of the infinite. When one touches this truth, even lightly, life becomes an unfolding rather than a struggle. The need to control fades. The need to justify oneself disappears. The need to defend, to compare, to compete, to grasp all of it falls away. For the self that emerges is already whole, already complete, already one with its source. This is the culmination of living from the finished kingdom, the revelation of the self that has always existed in God, untouched by time, free from fear, radiant in truth. And now, as we bring this period of contemplation to its close, let us once more turn our attention inward, not to seek, not to strive, not to achieve, but simply to abide in the awareness that the spiritual work is finished. Whatever the mind may believe, whatever the senses may report, whatever appearances may arise, the truth remains untouched. God's creation stands complete, and you live in that completeness. You see, all that we have explored together in this hour leads to a single gentle invitation: rest. Not the rest of inactivity, but the rest of trust. The rest that comes when we no longer attempt to carry the burden of life upon our personal shoulders. The rest that comes when we release our belief in personal responsibility for spiritual attainment. The rest that comes when we understand that God is the life, the mind, the substance, and the law of our being, and therefore nothing can be added and nothing can be taken away. The practice from this moment forward is not to remember every word you have heard, nor to analyze the principles discussed. The practice is simply to return again and again to the awareness of the presence, to pause long enough in the midst of your day to recognize where I stand, God is, to acknowledge, even if only inwardly, I need not fear appearances, for they have no power. The reality of God alone is power, to rest in the truth. Whatever is necessary for this moment is already present in the invisible, awaiting my recognition. As you cultivate this inner atmosphere, you will discover that life becomes more harmonious, not because you have learned new methods, but because you have ceased interfering with the divine unfoldment. You will find that challenges dissolve more quickly, not because you have gained greater control over circumstances, but because you have surrendered control altogether. You will notice that peace becomes your natural state because you have ceased identifying with a personal sense of self and have begun to live from the consciousness of the Christ. There may be times when you forget. There may be moments when fear reappears, when old patterns seem to return. Do not be troubled by this. Simply recognize that nothing has changed in God's reality. The finished kingdom has not wavered because your attention briefly shifted. Gently return to the truth. Gently return to the silence. Gently return to the awareness that the presence is here, now, complete. Remember always, you are not striving toward God, you are awakening to God. You are not trying to bring perfection into your life, you are learning to see the perfection that is already present. You are not walking toward a distant truth, you are allowing truth to rise within your consciousness. And so, as we leave this time together, let us rest not in words, not in concepts, but in the assurance that the same Spirit which lived as Jesus Christ, the same Spirit that revealed to him the truth of the finished work, lives also as you. It is not your personal wisdom that guides you, but the infinite intelligence that expresses itself through all creation. It is not your personal love that sustains you, but the love of God made visible as your life. It is not your personal strength that carries you, but the strength of the eternal that requires no effort. Let this be your assurance. The kingdom is finished. The work is finished. The truth is finished. And you, being the expression of God, are included in that finished, perfect, eternal expression. Rest in that. Trust in that. Live from that, for this is the secret Jesus revealed. This is the essence of Christ consciousness. This is the infinite way.
What if I told you that the very thing you've been seeking your entire life, peace, security, freedom from fear, has never been absent for even a moment? What if the divine presence you've been praying to reach has been closer than your own breath, waiting not to be found, but to be recognized? The universal promise. When the Master said, "I am with you always," he wasn't offering comfort for difficult times. He was revealing the eternal truth of being itself. This wasn't Jesus, the man, making a promise. This was the Christ, the divine consciousness that formed itself as Jesus, speaking the fundamental reality of all existence. You see, most of us have been conditioned to believe that God is somewhere out there in heaven, in temples, in sacred texts. And so we pray to God, we seek for God, we hope that God will hear us and come to us in our moment of need. But this very seeking perpetuates the illusion of separation that is the root of all fear. The nature of fear, let us look honestly at fear. What is it? Strip away all the different forms it takes: fear of failure, fear of loss, fear of illness, fear of death, and you'll find one core belief: I am alone. I am separate. I am vulnerable. Fear is always the voice of the separated sense of self, the ego that believes it is a fragment cut off from the whole, a wave that has forgotten it is the ocean. But here is the great revelation that mystics throughout all ages have discovered. There is no separate self to be afraid. There is only one self, one infinite consciousness, one divine presence expressing itself as the many. When Jesus said, "I am with you," he wasn't describing a relationship between two beings. He was revealing that there is only one I, and that divine I is the truth of your being right now, the Christ within now. This isn't mere philosophy or beautiful poetry. This is meant to be your living experience. The Christ isn't a historical figure you worship. The Christ is the name we give to God, individualized, to infinite consciousness, expressing as individual being. The Christ is what you are when the false sense of separate selfhood dissolves. When you sit in the silence, not the silence of an empty mind, but the silence that is alive with presence, you begin to feel this truth. You don't feel that God is with you, you experience that God is being you. The breath breathing itself, the heart beating itself, the awareness aware of itself. This isn't pantheism, this is the recognition that God constitutes your very being. From belief to experience, most spiritual seekers make a critical error. They try to use truth as a tool to fix their human problems. They want God to make their businesses successful, to heal their bodies, to protect their loved ones. And yes, harmony does appear in our experience as we awaken, but it doesn't come from using God, it comes from being God realized. You cannot demonstrate the presence, you can only be the presence aware of itself. Do you see the difference? One is still rooted in the belief that you are a person who needs God's help. The other is the recognition that the divine self is already living as you, and your only task is to stop interfering with its natural expression. When Jesus walked on water, he didn't pray to God for the power to defy gravity. He lived from the consciousness that knows I and my Father are one. There is no separation between the wave and the ocean, and so natural law bends to spiritual truth. Practical mysticism. Now, how do we move from intellectual understanding to lived experience? Through what we might call practical mysticism, the daily practice of turning within to that inner presence. Begin each day not with prayers of petition, not with affirmations, not with reading, but with silence. Sit quietly and dismiss every thought that enters. Not through struggle, but through recognition. That's just a thought. That's just mental activity. And in the space between thoughts, you'll begin to feel something, not think something, but feel something, a presence, a stillness, an isness that has no opposite. This presence isn't giving you anything because this presence is already all that you are. It isn't protecting you from danger because in truth there is nothing outside this infinite one that threatens you. It isn't with you, it is you. Living without fear, as this awareness deepens, something miraculous happens. Fear dissolves, not because your circumstances change, though they often do, not because you've been given promises or protection, though you begin to witness what looks like protection. Fear dissolves because the one who was afraid is seen through as an illusion. There's a beautiful paradox here. When you realize there is no separate self to protect, you discover you are protected by the very nature of being itself. When you stop trying to preserve and defend your personal sense of self, you find yourself living as the eternal self that has never been born and can never die. The practice of presence, this isn't something you achieve once and possess forever. This is a practice, a remembering, a constant return to the awareness of presence. Throughout your day, pause, stop whatever mental or physical activity you're engaged in and recognize the presence is here. The presence is here as my very consciousness. I and the Father are one. When challenges appear, and they will appear because we're living in a world that still believes in separation, don't fight them on their own level. Don't try to use spiritual truth to fix material problems. Instead, turn within to that place of presence and rest there until the problem is seen as the illusion it is. You cannot be with God and have fear at the same time. They're incompatible. Fear exists only in the belief of separation, and presence is the experience of unity. The great release, what freedom lies in this realization. You don't have to become spiritual enough. You don't have to practice long enough. You don't have to earn God's grace. You are already the very thing you've been seeking. The Christ consciousness that formed itself as Jesus is the same consciousness that is forming itself as you right now in this moment. Your only task, if we can even call it a task, is to stop, be still, and know. Not know about God, know God. Experience the presence that is closer than breathing, nearer than hands and feet. Closing truth. So when you feel fear arising, remember these words, I am with you, not as a promise of future comfort, but as a present reality. The divine I is with you because the divine I is you. There is nowhere you can go where this presence is not, because this presence is the very substance of your being. Do not fear. Not because nothing bad will happen. We're not making promises about human circumstances. Do not fear because you are finally awakening to what you are, the eternal, infinite, divine consciousness expressing as individual being. And that which is eternal has nothing to fear, for it has never been born and cannot die. This is the great secret the Master revealed before Abraham was, I am. Not I was, I am. The eternal now, the divine presence, and this same I am is the truth of your being. Live from this recognition, and you'll find yourself living a new kind of life, not free from challenges, but free within them. Not separate from God-seeking connection, but as God made manifest, living, breathing, being the divine presence itself. The divine presence is already within. God's presence isn't something we need to acquire or earn. It is the very substance of our being, waiting only for our recognition. Fear is the illusion of separation. All fear stems from the false belief that we are alone and separate from the infinite source that sustains all life. I am with you means I am as you. Christ consciousness isn't outside ourselves watching over us. It is the true identity of our being, the divine self that animates our existence. Contemplative silence reveals truth beyond words, beliefs, and mental. Striving lies the direct experience of presence that dissolves all anxiety and limitation. Living from Christhood, not seeking it. The spiritual life isn't about becoming something we're not, but recognizing what we already are and living from that realized truth. The divine presence isn't floating somewhere in a distant heaven, waiting for your prayers to reach it. It isn't standing outside your experience, observing you from afar, deciding whether to intervene in your affairs. This is the revolutionary truth that transforms everything. God is not separate from you, waiting to be contacted. God is the very consciousness by which you know you exist. Think for a moment about your awareness right now. You are aware that you're reading these words. You are aware of thoughts moving through your mind. You are aware of sensations in your body. But what is this awareness itself? This witnessing presence that observes everything, where does it come from? This is the divine presence. This is God being conscious as you. We've been taught to acquire spiritual qualities, to develop our connection with the divine, to become worthy enough to experience God's presence. But this entire paradigm is backwards. You cannot acquire what already constitutes your being. The eye cannot see itself, yet it is always present. The awareness cannot be aware of itself as an object, yet it is eternally here. In the same way, the divine presence is so intimate, so fundamental to your existence, that you've overlooked it your entire life while searching for something more dramatic, more distant, more difficult to attain. When you breathe, who is breathing? When your heart beats, who is beating it? When thoughts arise in consciousness, what is the consciousness in which they arise? This isn't poetic language. This is direct observation of reality. There is an infinite intelligence animating what you call your life, and this intelligence isn't something you possess. Rather, you are something this intelligence is doing. The great mystics didn't become holy people who finally reached God after years of effort. They simply woke up to what was always true. They recognized that the presence they had been seeking outwardly was the very substance of their innermost being, not a presence that came to them, but the presence they had always been. This recognition changes everything. You stop begging for what you already are. You stop seeking what has never been absent. You begin to live from a different center, not from the small, frightened self that feels separate and vulnerable, but from the infinite self that knows itself as the very ground of being. And this knowing isn't intellectual, it's a felt experience available to you right now in the simple recognition of the awareness that is aware of these very words. Fear, in all its manifestations, tells the same fundamental lie: you are alone in a hostile universe. Whether you fear poverty, illness, rejection, or death itself, the underlying message is identical. You are a separate fragment, vulnerable and isolated, at the mercy of forces beyond your control. But this narrative is built on a fiction so convincing that humanity has believed it for millennia. Watch fear closely when it arises. Notice that it always involves a sense of me that could be threatened, diminished, or destroyed. There's a self that might lose something precious. There's an identity that could be damaged. There's a person who stands apart from life itself, exposed to danger. This self, this separate me, is the breeding ground of all fear. Without the belief in separation, fear cannot exist. But here's what contemplative inquiry reveals. This separate self you've taken yourself to be is a mental construct, a collection of thoughts, memories, and conditioning that creates the illusion of being a distinct entity cut off from the whole. You've been hypnotized by your own thinking into believing you are a wave that somehow became disconnected from the ocean. The wave fears it will crash on the shore and disappear, not realizing it was never separate from the ocean to begin with. Every moment of fear is actually a moment of amnesia, a forgetting of your true nature as infinite consciousness itself. When you believe you are merely this body, this personality, this accumulation of experiences, you naturally fear anything that threatens this fragile construction. The body can sicken, relationships can end, possessions can be lost, success can turn to failure. And so you live in a constant state of vigilance, trying to protect what you believe yourself to be. But the divine presence knows no separation. In God's awareness, there are no isolated fragments, no separate cells competing for survival. There is only the one appearing as the many, the ocean expressing as countless waves, each wave a unique manifestation, yet never separate from the whole. This isn't philosophy. This is the actual nature of reality that fear obscures. When Jesus said, "I am with you," he was pointing to this indivisible unity. Not that God is accompanying you on your journey, but that the divine I is the only reality, expressing as what you call your existence. There is no gap between God and you that fear could inhabit. There is no distance across which danger could reach. There is only the infinite presence being all that is. The spiritual path isn't about destroying fear through willpower or positive thinking. It's about seeing through the illusion of separation that makes fear possible. When you recognize yourself as consciousness itself, not a thing in consciousness, but consciousness being aware, the one who was afraid is revealed as a phantom, and phantoms once seen clearly lose their power to frighten. This is why every spiritual tradition teaches some form of self-inquiry or meditation, not to acquire something new, but to dissolve the false sense of separation that is the root of all suffering. In the light of true seeing, fear doesn't need to be. Overcome it's simply recognized as the voice of an illusory self that never actually existed. Most people interpret Christ's promise, "I am with you always," as a comforting assurance that Jesus, or God, will accompany them through life's difficulties, like a divine companion walking beside them, ready to help when called upon. But this understanding, while comforting, misses the profound depth of what was actually being revealed. The Christ wasn't describing a relationship between two separate beings. The Christ was revealing identity itself. When the Master spoke these words, he wasn't speaking as Jesus the person, the man born in Bethlehem. He was speaking as the Christ, the divine consciousness that had realized itself fully in and through that individual expression. And what this consciousness was declaring is that it isn't merely with you in the sense of proximity or companionship, it is you. The I that said, "I am with you," is the same I that looks out through your eyes right now. This is the great mystery that transforms religion into realization. Christ consciousness isn't something outside yourself that watches over you. It's the deepest truth of what you are. When you say "I am," when you experience that fundamental sense of existence and awareness, you're touching the same infinite I am that spoke through Jesus, through Buddha, through every mystic who has awakened to their true nature. Consider the implications of this. If Christ is as you rather than merely with you, then you're not waiting for divine intervention from outside. You're not hoping that God will notice your struggles and send help. You're recognizing that the very power and presence you've been praying to is the consciousness by which you pray, the awareness in which all experience arises, the life that is living itself as what you call you. This understanding completely transforms your spiritual practice. You stop begging an external God for what you need. You stop feeling like a limited human trying to contact an unlimited divine. Instead, you begin to live from the recognition that divinity is your actual nature, temporarily obscured by the belief in being merely a separate person. The great teachers didn't have something you lack. They simply woke up to what they already were. They stopped identifying with the limited, personal sense of self and recognized themselves as the infinite expressing in individual form. And this same recognition is available to you, not as a future attainment, but as a present reality waiting only for acknowledgement. This is why Jesus could say, "Greater works than these shall you do, and the kingdom of God is within you." He wasn't speaking to inferior beings from a superior position. He was speaking as awakened consciousness to sleeping consciousness, inviting the recognition that what appeared as Jesus Christ is the same divine presence that appears as you. When you realize that Christ is as you, everything changes. You're no longer a powerless human hoping for divine rescue. You're the divine itself, temporarily forgetting its nature, now remembering. The I that is with you always is the I that you are. There aren't two, there's only one, appearing as the infinite diversity of life while remaining forever indivisible, forever whole, forever present as the very substance of your being. Words can point to truth, but they cannot give you the direct experience of it. Books can describe the ocean, but reading about water will never make you wet. Sermons can eloquently explain the nature of divine presence, but all the explanations in the world cannot substitute for the moment when you actually feel that presence alive within you. This is why every authentic spiritual tradition, beneath all its outer forms and rituals, teaches some practice of entering the silence. But understand what this silence truly is. It isn't merely the absence of noise or the quieting of mental chatter, though these may accompany it. The silence we speak of is capital S, silence A. Living, conscious stillness that exists prior to all thought, all emotion, all perception. It's the background against which all experience appears, the canvas upon which life paints itself, the space in which all form arises and dissolves. When you sit in contemplative silence, you're not trying to achieve anything or become anything. You're not attempting to contact God or manufacture spiritual experiences. You're simply releasing your grip on all mental activity and allowing yourself to rest in what already is. You dismiss thoughts, not violently, not through struggle, but through gentle recognition. This is just thinking. This is just mental noise. And in that dismissal, in that release, something extraordinary reveals itself. At first you might experience it as peace, as a subtle sense of relief from the constant mental commentary that usually dominates consciousness. But as you deepen into this practice, as you return again and again to the silence, something more profound emerges. You begin to sense a presence that isn't created by your meditation, but simply becomes obvious when mental activity subsides. It's as if the noise of thinking had been drowning out a symphony that was playing all along. This presence has qualities that cannot be adequately described, but can only be known through direct experience. It feels substantial yet formless. It's deeply personal yet infinite. It's utterly still yet vibrantly alive. And most importantly, it doesn't feel like something separate from you that you're observing. It feels like what you actually are when the false sense of separate selfhood temporarily dissolves. In this silence, the questions that tormented you lose their power. The fears that seemed so real are seen as shadows cast by thought. The sense of being alone and vulnerable evaporates because in this depth of silence there is no separate you to be alone. There's only the infinite presence being aware of itself. This isn't mystical imagination or self-hypnosis. This is direct perception of reality as it actually is, unfiltered by the conceptual mind. Every great mystic throughout history has pointed to this same experience, described it with different words from different traditions, but always indicating the same living truth. Beyond thought lies the direct experience of the divine. You cannot think your way to God, you cannot reason your way into presence, but you can be still, release all mental striving, and allow the truth that has always been present to reveal itself. In the silence, the words, "I am with you," stop being a concept and become a lived reality that transforms everything. The greatest obstacle to spiritual awakening isn't sin or unworthiness. It's the belief that you need to become something you're not. For years, perhaps decades, you've been trying to reach God, to attain Christ consciousness, to achieve enlightenment, as if these were distant destinations requiring endless struggle and sacrifice. But this entire approach perpetuates the very illusion that causes all suffering, the belief that you are currently something less than divine, something separate from God that must bridge an impossible gap. This seeking mentality keeps you locked in spiritual infancy. You read books, attend workshops, practice techniques, all in the hope that someday, if you do enough, if you're good enough, if you pray hard enough, you'll finally arrive at the spiritual state you've been chasing. But here's the liberating truth that ends all seeking: you cannot become what you already are. Christhood isn't a destination, it's your present identity, simply unrecognized. When Jesus said before Abraham was, "I am," he wasn't claiming a special status that separated him from humanity. He was revealing the eternal nature that is true of all being, the I am that existed before time, that will exist after all forms dissolve, that is here right now reading these words. This is the Christ, not Jesus' exclusive possession, but the one divine self expressing as all that is. Living from this recognition is entirely different from seeking it. When you seek Christhood, you're operating from the belief that you're a limited human trying to become spiritual. You're looking forward to some future transformation, some moment when you'll finally get it. This keeps you trapped in time, in becoming, in the endless postponement of truth. But when you live from Christhood, from the recognition that divine consciousness is already the substance of your being, everything shifts. You don't ask, "How can I become more spiritual?" You ask, "How can I stop pretending to be less than I am?" You don't try to acquire divine qualities. You allow the divinity that already constitutes your being to express itself naturally. This isn't arrogance or spiritual bypassing. It's the difference between a wave trying to become the ocean and a wave recognizing it has always been the ocean, appearing in wave form. The wave doesn't need to transform itself into ocean substance. It needs to recognize what it already is. Living from this recognition means you stop using spiritual practices as tools to fix your human problems. You stop bargaining with God. Stop trying to demonstrate supply or health or harmony as if these were achievements that prove your spiritual progress. Instead, you rest in the awareness that the infinite divine presence is already living as you, already being you, already expressing as your consciousness right now. Does this mean you stop practicing meditation or contemplation? Not at all. But the purpose changes entirely. You no longer practice to become enlightened. You practice to remember what's true, to clear away the mental fog that obscures your eternal nature, to live consciously from the Christ identity that has never been absent. The spiritual journey, properly understood, isn't a journey at all. It's a standing still, a ceasing of the search, a recognition that what you've been seeking across time and space has been the seeker itself all along. You, already that which you seek. Now live from that truth. And so we return to where we began, but now with new eyes, with awakened understanding. I am with you always. These aren't words of comfort for the fearful. They are words of revelation for those ready to see. You are not a separate self navigating a dangerous world, hoping that God will protect you. You are the divine presence itself, temporarily believing the dream of separation, now awakening to what has always been true. The I that spoke through Jesus is the I that is reading these words right now. There are not two. There is only one, appearing as the infinite diversity of existence. So what will you do with this understanding? Will you file it away as beautiful philosophy, returning tomorrow to the same fears, the same sense of separation, the same seeking for what you already are? Or will you begin right now to live from this recognition? Each morning when you awaken, before the world rushes in with its demands and distractions, sit in the silence, not to become spiritual, but to remember what you are, not to contact God, but to recognize that God is the consciousness by which you are aware. Let this become your foundation, not belief, not hope, but direct experience of the presence that is closer than your own breath. And when fear arises, as it will, for you are still living in a world that believes in separation, don't fight it with willpower or positive affirmations. Simply return to the truth. I and my Father are one. The presence is here. The presence is here as me, not as words to repeat, but as reality to recognize. This is practical mysticism. This is the secret of living without fear. Not because your circumstances will always be pleasant, we make no such promises, but because you'll finally know who and what you are, the eternal, infinite, divine consciousness expressing in individual form, and that which is eternal has nothing to fear, for it was never born and cannot die. The Master's promise wasn't that he would be with you. The promise was that the I am that he knew himself to be is the same I am that you are, one infinite presence, one divine self, appearing as the many while remaining forever one. Go now and live from this truth. Not perfectly, perfection isn't required, but consciously remembering again and again, I am the presence. The presence is expressing as me. And in this recognition, all fear dissolves like darkness before the light. Thank you.